"Don't fall in love with me," he warned softly as he kissed my forehead. And in that moment I realized that sometimes the most dangerous men are the ones who try the hardest to protect you. Lena Brooks had only been working at the Romano penthouse for 11 days. And in those 11 days, she had learned 3 very important rules. Rule number 1. Never look Adrian Romano directly in the eyes unless he speaks to you first. Rule number 2. Never ask questions about the men who come and go at strange hours wearing expensive suits and quiet expressions. And rule number 3. Never, under any circumstances, be alone in the same room with him. The penthouse sat 40 floors above downtown Manhattan. All polished marble floors, soft amber lighting, and windows that stretched from ceiling to floor like something out of an architecture magazine. Lena cleaned those floors every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., moving silently across surfaces that probably cost more than the small apartment she shared with her aunt in Queens. She liked the quiet hours before the rest of the staff arrived. Quiet meant safety. Quiet meant invisibility. And invisibility meant she could keep this job, keep sending money home, and keep her life simple. That had been the plan. Until tonight. Because tonight the silence inside the penthouse felt different, heavy in a way Lena couldn't quite explain. She had stayed late to finish polishing the kitchen counters after a private dinner Adrian Romano had hosted for a handful of business associates. The other staff had already left for the night, and the enormous apartment felt strangely empty now that the laughter and low conversations had faded away. Lena wiped the final streak from the marble countertop and glanced toward the hallway that led to the main living room. A faint glow from the city lights spilled through the tall windows, painting long shadows across the polished floor. She should leave. That was the sensible choice. Grab her coat, call a rideshare, and be back in Queens within 40 minutes. But something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the quiet footsteps she suddenly heard behind her. Maybe it was the strange awareness that someone had been watching her for longer than she realized. Lena turned slowly, and there he was. Adrian Romano stood near the entrance to the kitchen, tall and perfectly still, the soft city light outlining the sharp lines of his dark suit and broad shoulders. He wasn't an older man the way Lena had imagined when she first heard the name whispered among the staff. He looked maybe 35, with dark hair brushed back from his forehead and eyes that seemed almost black in the dim light. The rumors about him traveled through the staff like quiet electricity. Powerful, untouchable, the kind of man who could change someone's life with a single decision. And right now those dark eyes were fixed directly on her. Lena felt her heartbeat climb into her throat. She remembered rule number 1 immediately and lowered her gaze to the marble floor. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just finishing the kitchen." Silence followed. The kind of silence that stretches long enough to make you question every breath you take. Then she heard his footsteps again, slow and measured as he crossed the room. When he stopped in front of her, Lena could feel the warmth of his presence even though she still refused to lift her eyes. "You're the new one," Adrian said, his voice calm, deep, and unexpectedly gentle. Lena nodded. "Yes, sir." Another pause. Not uncomfortable, just curious, as if he were studying something unexpected. Then something happened that Lena would replay in her mind for weeks afterward. Adrian Romano reached out, gently touched the edge of her chin, and lifted her face just enough so their eyes met for the first time. His expression wasn't cold the way she had expected. If anything, it looked almost thoughtful. For a moment he simply studied her, like someone trying to solve a quiet puzzle. Then he leaned forward slightly and pressed a brief, soft kiss against her forehead. The gesture was so unexpected that Lena forgot how to breathe. When he pulled back, his voice dropped to a quiet warning. "Don't fall in love with me." Lena Brooks stood frozen in the center of the kitchen long after Adrian Romano stepped away from her. The warmth from where his lips had touched her forehead still lingered like the faint echo of something she could not quite explain. For several seconds she did not move, did not breathe, her mind struggling to understand what had just happened. In the 11 days she had worked inside the Romano penthouse. She had seen Adrian Romano exactly 3 times, and each of those moments had been from a distance of at least 20 feet. He moved through his own home like a quiet storm, surrounded by men who spoke in low voices and watched every hallway like they were guarding something important. The staff treated him with a careful kind of respect that was closer to caution than admiration. No one laughed when he walked into a room. No one spoke unless he spoke first, and absolutely no one stood close enough to touch him. Yet tonight he had stepped into the kitchen alone, crossed the polished marble floor with that calm confidence that seemed to belong to men who never doubted their place in the world, and touched her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lena finally remembered to inhale and quickly stepped back, gripping the edge of the marble counter with both hands. Her heart beat so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Adrian Romano remained where he stood, watching her with the same quiet focus that had unsettled her the moment their eyes met. He did not look angry. He did not look amused. If anything, he looked thoughtful, as if something about this moment had surprised him too. Lena forced herself to look down again, remembering the rules she had learned during her first morning orientation with the head housekeeper. People like him existed in a different world. A world where decisions were made quickly and consequences lasted forever. It was not a place where someone like her belonged. "Sir," she said carefully, her voice steadier now, but still soft enough that it barely carried across the room. "I did not mean to stay so late. I was finishing the counters." Adrian did not answer right away. Instead, he moved slowly toward the wide windows that overlooked the glowing Manhattan skyline. 40 floors below, traffic crawled through the streets like ribbons of white and red light. The city never really slept. It simply slowed down for a few hours before starting again. He rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair near the window and looked out across the skyline for a long moment before speaking again. "How long have you worked here?" His voice carried the same calm tone it had before, but now it sounded almost curious. Lena hesitated before answering. 11 days, sir." Adrian nodded once, still facing the window. "And in those 11 days, has anyone explained to you why the rules exist?" Lena blinked, unsure how to answer. The truth was simple. The rules existed because people were afraid of the man standing 10 feet away from her. But saying that out loud felt like a terrible mistake waiting to happen. She chose the safest answer instead. "They said the rules helped the house run smoothly." Adrian turned then, leaning one shoulder against the window frame as he looked at her again. For the first time since entering the kitchen, something faintly amused appeared in his expression. "That is one way to explain it," he said quietly. Lena kept her eyes lowered, but curiosity tugged at her thoughts despite her best effort to remain invisible. Nothing about this moment matched the rumors she had heard whispered among the staff. The stories described a man who was distant, intimidating, and impossible to read. But the man standing in front of her now looked more like someone studying a problem he had not expected to encounter. The silence stretched again, not tense this time, just thoughtful. Finally, Adrian straightened and adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. "You should go home," he said. "It is past midnight." Lena glanced at the small clock above the espresso machine. 12:16 a.m. She had not realized how late it had become. "Yes, sir." She reached for her coat that hung neatly on the back of a kitchen chair, pulling it over her shoulders with quick, practiced movements. But just as she stepped toward the hallway that led to the elevator, Adrian spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Lena." She stopped instantly. Hearing her name from him felt strangely personal, as if the invisible barrier between employer and staff had shifted slightly. Slowly she turned back toward him. Adrian Romano was still watching her with that same steady gaze. For a moment it looked as though he might say something else. Instead, he simply nodded toward the hallway. "Be careful on your way home." The words were simple, but something about the way he said them made Lena feel as if the night had quietly changed in a way she could not yet understand. Lena Brooks stepped out of the Romano building just after 12:20 in the morning, and the cool Manhattan air felt different against her skin than it had earlier that evening. The city was quieter now, but not silent. A few yellow taxis rolled through the intersection 2 blocks away, and somewhere in the distance a subway train rumbled beneath the pavement. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and paused at the edge of the sidewalk, trying to steady the strange swirl of thoughts moving through her mind. The doorman offered her a polite nod as she passed, the same respectful gesture he gave every staff member who worked inside the building. Lena returned the nod with a small smile, then began the familiar walk toward the corner where she usually waited for a ride back to Queens. Normally the routine was simple. Work her shift, clean the endless marble surfaces and polish glass tables, avoid attention, then leave quietly before midnight. But tonight something felt unsettled inside her, like a quiet ripple spreading through calm water. She kept replaying the moment in the kitchen over and over again. The way Adrian Romano had appeared without warning. The calm tone of his voice. The strange gentleness in his eyes that did not match the rumors whispered by the other staff. Lena had heard enough stories during her first week to know that Adrian Romano was not just another wealthy business owner living in a luxury penthouse. His name carried weight in the city. Not the loud kind of fame that appeared on billboards or magazine covers, but the quieter kind that made people lower their voices when they said it out loud. Men in expensive suits visited him at all hours of the night. Private meetings took place behind closed doors in the living room overlooking the skyline. Deliveries arrived that the staff were never asked to open. And yet the strangest part of it all was how carefully the household ran. Every staff member had a schedule. Every room had a specific cleaning routine. Even the temperature of the wine cellar was checked twice a day by the head housekeeper. Order was important inside the Romano penthouse. Precision mattered. And Adrian Romano himself seemed to move through that carefully organized world like a man who had built every rule himself. Lena reached the corner and checked her phone for a ride. The screen glowed softly in the darkness as she waited. And for the first time she realized her hands were still slightly trembling. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to confusion. Because the man she had encountered tonight did not match the image she had created in her mind during the past 11 days. She had expected someone distant and cold. Someone who barely noticed the staff moving around him like quiet shadows. But the man in the kitchen had spoken her name. Not sharply. Not impatiently, just calmly, as if it belonged in the room with them. The memory made her shake her head slightly, as if trying to clear it away. People like Adrian Romano lived in a world far removed from the one she knew. Lena had grown up in a small brick apartment building in Brooklyn where neighbors borrowed sugar from each other and children played basketball in the street until the streetlights flickered on. Her life had always been simple and direct. Work hard, help family, stay out of trouble. Those rules had carried her 26 years without complication. Yet tonight she had stepped into something she did not fully understand. A black sedan rolled slowly past the corner, and Lena barely noticed it. Her thoughts still caught in the quiet moment she had shared with the most powerful man she had ever met. The driver glanced toward her briefly before continuing down the street. Lena finally spotted her rideshare pulling up beside the curb and quickly climbed into the back seat. As the car pulled away from the glowing Romano building behind her, she looked out the window at the towering glass structure rising 40 stories into the sky. For a moment, she wondered if Adrian Romano was still standing near those tall windows overlooking the city. Then she turned away from the thought and told herself something simple and sensible. Tomorrow morning, everything would return to normal. She would arrive at 6:30 sharp. She would polish the marble floors. She would follow the rules that kept the household running smoothly. And she would stay invisible, exactly the way she had planned from the beginning. Lena Brooks arrived back at the Romano penthouse the next morning at exactly 6:28 a.m., 2 minutes earlier than her scheduled start time, because arriving early had always been one of her quiet habits. The elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor. With a soft chime, and the familiar calm of the penthouse greeted her the moment she stepped inside. Morning light spilled through the enormous floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the polished marble floors into long mirrors of gold and pale blue sky. The city outside was already waking up. Cars moved steadily along the avenues below, and sunlight reflected off the glass towers that surrounded the building like silent giants. Lena hung her coat neatly in the staff closet and tied her apron with careful precision before stepping into the main living area. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The enormous cream-colored sofa faced the skyline. The long glass dining table stood perfectly aligned beneath the modern chandelier. Even the silver coffee tray resting on the sideboard appeared untouched. It was as if the strange moment in the kitchen the night before had never happened at all. Lena moved quietly across the marble floor with a soft cleaning cloth in her hand, polishing the smooth surface of the dining table with steady circular motions. This routine was familiar, predictable, safe. Each movement had a rhythm she could follow without thinking too much about anything else. But despite the calm surroundings, her mind kept drifting back to the same memory. The quiet tone of Adrian Romano's voice. The unexpected warmth of his hand when he had lifted her chin. The strange gentleness of the moment that had followed. Lena shook her head slightly, focusing harder on the surface she was polishing. People often misread moments like that. Maybe he had simply been distracted. Maybe he had mistaken her for someone else. Whatever the reason, it was not something she should spend time thinking about. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Delgado, entered the room a few minutes later carrying a small clipboard and wearing the same perfectly pressed uniform she wore every morning. Mrs. Delgado had been running the Romano household for more than 12 years, and she carried herself with the calm authority of someone who understood exactly how every corner of the penthouse operated. She glanced briefly at Lena before marking something on her clipboard. "You stayed late last night," Mrs. Delgado said in a neutral tone. Lena paused for half a second before answering. "Yes, ma'am. The dinner service ran longer than expected." Mrs. Delgado nodded once. "That happens sometimes." Her eyes moved slowly around the room as if inspecting every detail. "Everything in order this morning?" Lena followed her gaze across the spotless surfaces. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Delgado made another quick note on her clipboard and turned toward the hallway leading to the private study. "Mr. Romano is still in his office. He arrived very early today." Lena's hand froze for just a moment against the polished glass table. She had not expected that. Adrian Romano rarely appeared during the early morning hours when the staff completed their cleaning routine. Most days the penthouse remained quiet until late morning. Mrs. Delgado continued speaking without noticing Lena's brief pause. "We have a small breakfast meeting scheduled for 8:30. Make sure the coffee service is prepared by 8:15. "Yes, ma'am," Lena replied softly. Mrs. Delgado gave a satisfied nod before walking toward the staff office down the hallway. Lena exhaled slowly once she was alone again. Somewhere beyond the closed doors of the private study, Adrian Romano was already awake and working. The thought sent a small ripple of awareness through her chest. She turned her attention back to the dining table, finishing the final pass with the cloth until the glass shone perfectly under the morning light. Invisible. That was still the plan. Do the job well. Follow the rules. Stay unnoticed. Lena set the cloth neatly beside the silver tray and walked toward the kitchen to prepare the coffee service. But as she passed the quiet hallway that led toward the private study, she could not help noticing that the door was slightly open, and faint sunlight from the window inside stretched across the polished floor like a silent invitation. The hallway outside Adrian Romano's private study remained quiet as Lena Brooks passed it on her way to the kitchen, but the slightly open door continued to pull at her attention in a way she could not quite explain. Sunlight from the tall windows inside the office spilled across the polished floor like a narrow path of gold, and through that opening, she could hear the faint rustle of papers being turned. She slowed her steps without meaning to, reminding herself immediately of the rule she had learned on her first morning in the penthouse. The private study was not part of the staff routine unless Mrs. Delgado specifically assigned someone to clean it. That room belonged entirely to Adrian Romano. Lena forced herself to keep walking, entering the large kitchen where the stainless steel counters gleamed beneath the overhead lights. The coffee service for the morning meeting needed to be prepared by 8:15, and the clock above the refrigerator read 7:42. Plenty of time. She moved through the routine with practiced precision, measuring fresh coffee beans into the grinder, filling the water reservoir, arranging the white porcelain cups neatly on the silver serving tray. The simple rhythm of preparation helped quiet the restless thoughts that had followed her since the night before. Outside the kitchen windows, the early sunlight brightened the skyline, and the faint hum of traffic far below drifted upward through the glass. Everything about the morning felt normal again, orderly and calm, exactly the way the Romano household always operated. Lena placed the final spoon beside the row of cups and lifted the tray carefully, testing the balance with steady hands. She turned toward the hallway leading back to the living room, stepping slowly across the marble floor so the cups would not rattle against the tray. As she approached the corridor near the private study again, the same quiet awareness returned. The door was still slightly open. She could see the edge of a dark wooden desk through the narrow gap, along with the pale glow of the city skyline behind it. Lena kept her gaze forward and continued walking, determined not to let curiosity pull her into a situation that could cost her job. But just as she reached the living room, a calm voice spoke from the hallway behind her. "Lena." Her name stopped her instantly. She turned carefully, holding the tray steady against her palms. Adrian Romano stood in the doorway of the private study now, one hand resting lightly against the frame. Morning light from the window behind him outlined his tall figure in a soft halo of brightness. He was not wearing the dark suit she had seen the night before. Instead, he wore a simple white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, the top button undone, as if he had been working for hours already. In one hand, he held a pair of reading glasses, which he folded calmly before setting them on the small table beside the door. Lena lowered her eyes politely, remembering the rules even though the sound of her name from his voice still felt strangely personal. "Good morning, sir," she said softly. Adrian studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful but not distant. His gaze shifted briefly to the tray in her hands. "Coffee for the meeting?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Delgado scheduled a breakfast meeting for 8:30. Adrian nodded once. "You are very precise with your timing." Lena was not sure if that was a compliment or a simple observation. "I try to keep things organized, sir." Adrian stepped a little farther into the hallway, and the sunlight from the study window stretched across the floor between them. "That is a useful skill in this house," he said quietly. Lena felt the familiar nervous flutter in her chest again, the same quiet awareness she had felt the night before in the kitchen. She shifted the tray slightly in her hands, ready to continue toward the dining room. But Adrian's calm voice stopped her once more. "When you finish the coffee service," he said, "come back to the study. I would like to speak with you for a moment." Lena blinked in quiet surprise before lowering her gaze again. "Yes, sir." Adrian gave a small nod and returned inside the study, the door closing gently behind him. Lena stood in the hallway for a second longer than necessary, steadying the tray in her hands before continuing toward the dining table where the morning meeting would soon begin. Lena Brooks moved through the breakfast preparations with careful precision, but the quiet instruction Adrian Romano had given her continued to echo in her thoughts. "When you finish the coffee service, come back to the study." The words had been simple, spoken calmly, yet they carried a weight that made her heartbeat feel slightly faster every time she remembered them. In the 11 days she had worked inside the penthouse, Adrian Romano had never asked to speak with her directly. Not once. Staff members existed on the edges of his world, part of the quiet structure that kept the household running smoothly, but never part of his conversations. Lena set the porcelain cups carefully along the center of the long glass dining table, while sunlight from the skyline windows spilled across the polished surface. At 8:27 the first guest arrived. A man in a dark gray suit stepped through the front entrance with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to private meetings in rooms like this. Mrs. Delgado greeted him politely and guided him toward the table where the coffee service waited. Within a few minutes, 2 more guests arrived, both speaking in calm professional tones as they discussed something about investment schedules and upcoming travel plans. Lena kept her movements quiet and efficient, pouring coffee when needed and stepping back when the conversation turned serious. By 8:45 the meeting was fully underway, and her role in the room was finished. She collected the empty tray from the sideboard and carried it silently back toward the kitchen. The moment the kitchen door closed behind her, the atmosphere shifted again into the quiet rhythm she preferred. The sound of low conversation from the dining room faded into the distance, replaced by the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Lena rinsed the coffee pot slowly beneath warm water, focusing on the simple task in front of her. Yet the same thought kept returning. Adrian Romano was waiting in the study. She dried the pot carefully and returned it to its place on the counter. Then she untied her apron and hung it neatly on the hook near the staff entrance. For a brief moment, she considered asking Mrs. Delgado if she should report to the study, but something told her that would only create unnecessary attention. Adrian Romano had spoken to her directly. That meant the request had been meant for her alone. Lena stepped back into the hallway and walked slowly toward the study door. The morning light in the corridor had shifted slightly, now brighter as the sun climbed higher above the city skyline. When she reached the door, she paused for a second, gathering the calm composure she always carried into unfamiliar situations. Then she lifted her hand and knocked gently against the wood. "Come in," Adrian's voice answered from inside. Lena pushed the door open and stepped into the study for the first time since she had started working at the penthouse. The room was larger than she expected, with tall shelves of books lining one wall and a wide desk positioned near the windows overlooking Manhattan. Adrian Romano sat behind that desk reviewing his set of papers, the same white shirt sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. When he looked up, the faintest hint of a smile appeared in his expression, as though he had expected her to hesitate longer before entering. "Good," he said calmly. "You came." Lena stood near the doorway with her hands lightly folded in front of her. "You asked to speak with me, sir." Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her with the same thoughtful attention she had noticed the night before. The sunlight from the windows behind him cast a warm glow across the study, softening the sharp lines of the room. "Yes," he said quietly. "I did." For a moment he said nothing more, simply observing her in silence. Then he placed the papers aside and folded his hands on the desk. "Tell me something, Lena," he said. "Why did you choose to work here?" The question caught her completely off guard. She had expected instructions, perhaps a correction about something she had done wrong, but not a question about herself. Lena hesitated briefly before answering honestly. "I needed the job, sir." Adrian's eyes remained steady on her face. "That is the practical answer," he said softly. "But it is not the whole one." Lena blinked, unsure what he meant. Adrian stood from the desk and walked slowly toward the window, looking out over the vast city stretching beneath the morning sun. "People rarely come into my world without a reason," he said quietly. "I prefer to understand those reasons." Lena felt the same quiet tension returning to the room, but this time it was mixed with curiosity rather than fear. She took a small breath and answered carefully. "I came because it was an opportunity, and because my family depends on me." Adrian turned slightly, his expression thoughtful again. "Family," he repeated. Then he nodded once, as if that word explained more than she realized. Lena Brooks stood quietly in the center of Adrian Romano's study as the morning sunlight stretched across the polished wooden floor, and for the first time since she had entered the penthouse 11 days earlier, she felt as though she had stepped into the true center of the world that surrounded him. Adrian remained near the window, overlooking the skyline, the vast city of Manhattan spreading out beneath the glass like a living map of moving lights and distant streets. When he repeated the word family, something thoughtful settled across his expression, as if the idea carried a weight far deeper than the simple explanation Lena had offered. For a few seconds, he said nothing more, simply watching the slow rhythm of traffic moving below the building. Lena waited respectfully near the desk with her hands folded lightly together, uncertain whether she had said too much or not enough. Silence inside the study felt different from silence anywhere else in the penthouse. It was quieter, more deliberate, as though every moment inside the room belonged to decisions that shaped the life Adrian Romano lived beyond these walls. Finally, he turned slightly and looked at her again. "Most people who work here try very hard not to be noticed," he said calmly. "You do the same." Lena blinked once in mild surprise. "Yes, sir." Adrian studied her for a moment longer, then walked slowly back toward the desk. "But last night you were not invisible," he continued. Lena felt a small ripple of tension move through her chest. The memory of the kitchen returned immediately, vivid and unexpected. "I did not intend to disturb anything, sir," she said quietly. Adrian rested one hand against the edge of the desk, the faintest hint of amusement touching his voice. "You did not disturb anything." He paused, as though choosing his next words carefully. "You simply stood there and looked at me as if you were not afraid." Lena hesitated before answering. "Should I have been?" Adrian's expression shifted slightly, not offended, just thoughtful. "Most people are," he replied. Lena considered that answer for a moment. She had heard the rumors like everyone else. The quiet conversations among the staff. The way visiting businessmen spoke to Adrian Romano with careful respect. The subtle tension that seemed to follow him whenever he entered a room. Yet the man standing in front of her now did not look frightening. He looked calm, focused, perhaps even a little tired beneath the controlled confidence he carried. "I respect the rules here," Lena said carefully. "But I do not assume things about people I have just met." Adrian watched her closely, and for a brief moment the room felt even quieter than before. Then he nodded once, slowly. "That is a rare approach." Lena lowered her eyes again out of habit, though the tension she had felt earlier was beginning to soften into something closer to curiosity. Adrian moved around the desk and leaned lightly against the edge, folding his arms across his chest. "You said your family depends on you," he continued. Lena nodded. "Yes, sir." "Tell me about them." The request was simple, but it caught her off guard again. Lena had never expected Adrian Romano to ask about her life beyond the penthouse. She took a small breath before answering. My aunt raised me after my mother passed away. She still lives in Queens. I help with her rent and medical bills. Adrian listened without interrupting. And your father? Lena shook her head gently. He left when I was very young. Adrian's gaze softened slightly, though his voice remained calm and steady. That explains the sense of responsibility. Lena was not sure how to respond to that observation. For most of her life, responsibility had simply been part of daily routine, not something she analyzed or explained. Adrian seemed to understand her hesitation. After a moment, he gave a small nod toward the doorway. You should return to your work, he said. Lena relaxed slightly, assuming the conversation had ended. But as she turned toward the door, Adrian spoke again, his voice quiet but unmistakably clear. Lena. She paused and looked back. Adrian Romano was watching her with the same thoughtful expression she had begun to recognize. The rules in this house exist for a reason, he said calmly. They protect people from becoming involved in situations they may not understand. Lena nodded respectfully. Yes, sir. Adrian held her gaze for one final moment. Just remember that. Lena stepped into the hallway and gently closed the study door behind her. But as she walked back toward the kitchen, the quiet warning remained in her thoughts. Because for the first time since she had started working there, it felt as though the invisible distance between her world and Adrian Romano's world had shifted just slightly. Lena Brooks returned to the kitchen with the quiet composure she had practiced for years. Yet the conversation inside Adrian Romano's study continued to move through her thoughts like a slow ripple across still water. The hallway behind her fell silent once again as the study door closed, and the rest of the penthouse resumed its calm rhythm of morning routine. From the dining room, she could still hear the faint murmur of conversation from the breakfast meeting, low voices discussing schedules and plans in tones that sounded controlled and professional. Lena stepped toward the stainless steel counter and picked up a clean cloth, wiping the already spotless surface simply to give her hands something to do. For most people, a conversation like the one she had just experienced would have felt ordinary. But nothing about speaking with Adrian Romano felt ordinary. The man carried a presence that seemed to shape the atmosphere around him without effort. Even the silence in the study had felt different from silence anywhere else in the building. Lena rinsed a glass beneath the faucet and placed it carefully into the drying rack. The cool stream of water helped her clear the lingering tension from her thoughts. She reminded herself of the simple plan she had made the day she accepted the job. Work quietly. Follow the rules. Stay invisible. Those rules had protected her for 26 years in a world that rarely offered second chances to people who made mistakes. Yet something about the conversation in the study had made the rules feel less certain than before. Adrian Romano had not spoken to her like an employer correcting a member of the staff. He had spoken to her like someone studying a question he had not yet answered. Lena dried her hands and stepped toward the window above the kitchen sink. From there, she could see the edge of Central Park stretching like a ribbon of green between the tall buildings of Manhattan. Morning sunlight filled the sky now, bright and clear, reflecting off the glass towers across the city. Somewhere out there, thousands of people were beginning ordinary days, walking to work, buying coffee, rushing through crowded sidewalks without thinking about the quiet worlds that existed inside buildings like this one. Lena watched the movement of the city for a moment before returning her attention to the kitchen. The breakfast meeting would end soon, and the staff would begin clearing the table. She turned toward the pantry shelves and began preparing fresh linens for the dining room. The routine helped steady her thoughts again. Each folded napkin, each polished spoon, each small detail returned her focus to the simple work she understood. But just as she placed the final stack of linens on the tray, the kitchen door opened softly behind her. Mrs. Delgado stepped inside carrying her clipboard, her calm expression unchanged as always. The meeting will conclude in about 10 minutes, she said. Lena nodded. I will prepare the table for clearing. Mrs. Delgado studied her for a brief moment, as though measuring something in her expression. Mr. Romano spoke with you earlier. Lena hesitated only slightly before answering. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Delgado nodded once. He does not often call staff into the study. Her voice was not suspicious, merely observant. Lena lowered her gaze politely. He asked about my family. Mrs. Delgado made a small mark on her clipboard, then closed it gently. Mr. Romano values loyalty, she said quietly, and he pays attention to the people around him more than most realize. Lena absorbed that comment silently. Mrs. Delgado turned toward the dining room door, but paused before leaving the kitchen. Just remember something important, Lena, she added calmly. Working here means standing close to a world that most people never see. It is wise to keep a clear sense of where you belong. Lena nodded again, understanding the quiet warning hidden inside the words. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Delgado gave a brief approving nod and stepped back into the hallway. Lena remained standing in the kitchen for a moment longer, the folded linens resting in her hands. The warning Adrian Romano had given her in the study echoed faintly in her memory, now joined by the calm advice of the head housekeeper. The rules existed for a reason. The distance between his world and hers was meant to remain clear. Lena lifted the tray of linens and walked toward the dining room, determined to return her focus to the routine that had always kept her safe. Even though a small part of her already sensed that the quiet balance of the past 11 days had begun to change. Lena Brooks stepped quietly into the dining room carrying the folded linens, and the conversation around the long glass table softened as the morning meeting approached its end. 3 men in tailored suits sat across from Adrian Romano discussing schedules and travel arrangements in calm, measured voices that never rose above a professional tone. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows behind them, reflecting off the polished surface of the table and the silver coffee service that Lena had placed there earlier. She moved with the same careful precision she had practiced since her first day, replacing napkins, collecting empty cups, and refreshing the small pitcher of cream without interrupting the conversation. Adrian Romano barely glanced in her direction as she worked, yet Lena could feel his quiet awareness in the room the same way someone might sense a shift in temperature without looking directly at the window. When the final guest finished speaking, Adrian closed the slim leather folder in front of him and stood from his chair. The movement was subtle, but the effect was immediate. The meeting had ended. The 3 visitors rose as well, exchanging brief handshakes and quiet words of thanks before Mrs. Delgado guided them toward the front entrance. Lena continued clearing the table while the soft echo of their footsteps faded down the hallway. Within minutes the penthouse returned to its usual calm. The dining room felt larger once the guests were gone, the silence returning like a calm tide settling back into place. Lena gathered the last of the empty cups onto the tray and turned toward the kitchen, but before she could step away, she heard Adrian's voice behind her. You move through a room like someone who has been doing this for years. Lena turned slightly, holding the tray steady in both hands. Adrian Romano stood near the end of the table, his expression thoughtful rather than critical. I have worked in restaurants before, she replied quietly. Adrian nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Restaurants teach awareness, he said calmly. You learn how to read people without asking questions. Lena hesitated before answering. It helps to understand what someone might need before they say it. Adrian's gaze rested on her for a moment longer, then shifted toward the skyline beyond the windows. That is a useful skill, he said quietly. Lena expected the conversation to end there, but Adrian remained where he stood, his attention still on the distant buildings rising across Manhattan. The city outside the glass seemed endlessly alive, thousands of people moving through streets that twisted between towers of steel and light. New York rewards people who pay attention, Adrian continued after a moment. Most survive here by learning quickly. Lena was not sure if he was speaking about the city or something else entirely. She placed the empty cups carefully onto the tray and prepared to return to the kitchen when Adrian spoke again. Your aunt in Queens, he said calmly, still looking toward the skyline. Does she know where you work? Lena paused, surprised that he remembered the detail she had mentioned earlier in the study. She knows I work in Manhattan, Lena answered carefully. Adrian turned back toward her, his expression unreadable but not unfriendly. And she is comfortable with that? Lena considered the question for a moment. She trusts that I make responsible decisions. Adrian nodded slowly as if weighing those words against something in his own thoughts. Then he stepped away from the window and walked toward the hallway leading back to his study. Before disappearing through the doorway, he glanced back at Lena one more time. That kind of trust is rare, he said quietly. Lena watched the study door close again, the soft click echoing through the otherwise silent room. She stood there for a moment longer with the tray balanced in her hands, the quiet weight of his words lingering in the air around her. Because the way Adrian Romano had said that sentence sounded less like a comment and more like a quiet understanding that he knew exactly how much responsibility someone like Lena carried beyond the walls of the penthouse. Lena Brooks carried the tray of empty cups back into the kitchen and placed it carefully on the stainless steel counter. Yet Adrian Romano's quiet words continued to linger in her thoughts like a slow echo. That kind of trust is rare. The sentence had been simple, but the tone behind it had felt deeper than a casual observation. Lena rinsed each cup under warm water, her movements steady and precise as she returned them one by one to the drying rack. Outside the kitchen window, the city had fully awakened now. Late morning sunlight reflected across the tall buildings of Manhattan, and the distant hum of traffic drifted faintly through the glass. For a moment, Lena allowed herself to breathe in the quiet rhythm of the room. Kitchens had always felt safe to her. No matter where she worked, the kitchen was the place where routines stayed predictable. Clean the counters, wash the dishes, prepare the next service. The tasks were simple and clear, and simple things had always helped her keep her life balanced. Yet today something felt slightly different. Adrian Romano had noticed details about her life that no employer had ever asked about before. Her family, her responsibility, even the way she moved through the room. Lena finished drying the last porcelain cup and returned it neatly to the cabinet above the counter. She reminded herself that the moment inside the dining room meant nothing more than a passing conversation. People in positions of power often asked questions simply to understand the people around them. That was all it had been. Nothing more. The kitchen door opened quietly, and Mrs. Delgado stepped inside again, her clipboard still resting beneath one arm. She glanced toward the cleaned coffee service with quiet approval. "Everything cleared?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Lena replied. Mrs. Delgado nodded once and set the clipboard on the counter. "The afternoon schedule will be light today. Mr. Romano has no additional meetings until evening." Lena listened while drying her hands on a clean towel. "That gives us time to finish the weekly inventory and polish the silver cabinet." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Delgado studied Lena for a moment, as though considering something unspoken. "You handled the dining room well this morning." Lena offered a small polite nod. "Thank you." Mrs. Delgado picked up the clipboard again, but did not immediately leave the room. "Mr. Romano values people who remain calm in his presence," she said quietly. "Not everyone does." Lena understood the meaning behind the comment. "I try to focus on my work." Mrs. Delgado's expression softened slightly. "That is wise." With that, she turned and stepped back into the hallway, leaving the kitchen quiet once more. Lena placed the towel neatly beside the sink and turned toward the pantry shelves to begin organizing the silver inventory. The familiar routine steadied her thoughts again. Yet as she polished the first row of silver spoons, the soft sound of footsteps approached from the hallway. A moment later, Adrian Romano appeared in the kitchen doorway. He did not step inside immediately. Instead, he leaned one shoulder lightly against the frame, watching her work with the same calm attention she had begun to recognize. Lena set the spoon gently on the cloth and lowered her gaze respectfully. "Good morning again, sir." Adrian gave a small nod. "You work quickly." Lena folded the cloth carefully before answering. "It helps keep things organized." Adrian stepped into the kitchen now, his presence filling the quiet space without effort. For a moment, he simply observed the neatly arranged rows of polished silver resting on the counter. Then he looked back at Lena. "You said your aunt lives in Queens," he said calmly. Lena nodded. "Yes, sir." Adrian rested his hands lightly on the edge of the counter. "Queens is about 40 minutes from here, depending on traffic." Lena blinked slightly, surprised that he knew the distance so precisely. "Yes, sir." Adrian studied her face for a moment as though considering a decision. Then he spoke again, his voice quiet but certain. "You should leave early today." Lena looked up in mild confusion. "Sir." Adrian's expression remained calm. "Spend the afternoon with your family." The suggestion caught her completely off guard. "That is not necessary," Lena said gently. Adrian shook his head once. Responsibility does not disappear when someone is working long hours. He paused briefly before adding, "Take the time." Lena hesitated, unsure how to respond. No employer had ever encouraged her to leave work early for something personal. Adrian seemed to recognize the uncertainty in her expression. Consider it a simple decision, he said quietly. One person noticing another. Lena lowered her gaze again, unsure why that sentence made the room feel suddenly quieter than before. Lena Brooks remained standing beside the polished counter for a few seconds after Adrian Romano finished speaking, the quiet suggestion he had made still settling into her thoughts. Spend the afternoon with your family. The words felt strangely unfamiliar in a place like this, where schedules were usually planned down to the minute and every task followed a clear structure. She looked down at the row of silver spoons she had been polishing, then back toward the calm figure standing across from her. Adrian Romano had already stepped away from the counter, as though the decision he had made required no further discussion. He poured himself a glass of water from the kitchen dispenser and took a slow sip while watching the sunlight spill across the marble floor. Lena spoke carefully, choosing her words with the same discipline she used in every unfamiliar situation. I appreciate the offer, sir, but there is still work that needs to be completed today. Adrian placed the glass back on the counter and studied her for a moment, not impatient, simply thoughtful. Work will always exist, he replied calmly. Family does not always wait. Lena hesitated. The simple truth inside that sentence made it difficult to answer quickly. Adrian did not push the conversation further. Instead, he walked slowly toward the window at the far end of the kitchen where the skyline stretched endlessly beyond the glass. The sunlight illuminated the edges of his white shirt as he rested one hand lightly on the windowsill. When I was younger, he said quietly, almost as if speaking more to the city than to Lena, I spent many years believing that responsibility meant never stepping away from work. Lena remained silent, unsure whether the words were meant as a lesson or simply a reflection. Adrian continued after a moment. It took time to realize that responsibility can mean something else entirely. He turned slightly and looked back at her. Sometimes it means recognizing when someone else needs you more than the job does. Lena felt a subtle shift in the room again, the same quiet awareness that had followed their earlier conversations. She folded the polishing cloth neatly and set it beside the tray before answering. My aunt would probably tell you the same thing. Adrian nodded faintly, as though the response confirmed something he had already expected. Then she sounds like a wise woman. Lena allowed herself a small smile at that. Adrian moved away from the window and toward the doorway again, his presence calm but purposeful. Before leaving the kitchen, he paused and glanced back toward her. The car service downstairs can take you to Queens, he said. Tell them I approved it. Lena blinked in surprise. That is not necessary, sir. Adrian's expression remained steady. It is convenient. The simplicity of his tone made it clear that the matter had already been decided. Lena lowered her gaze respectfully. Thank you. Adrian gave a brief nod and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the kitchen quiet once more. Lena stood still for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the counter. No employer had ever arranged something like that for her before. Most expected their staff to solve their own transportation and personal schedules without assistance. Yet Adrian Romano had spoken about it as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She looked once more at the skyline through the kitchen window, the bright towers of Manhattan rising against the clear afternoon sky. Then she took a slow breath and untied her apron, hanging it neatly on the hook beside the staff door. For the first time since starting her job in the Penthouse, she was leaving in the middle of the day, and as she stepped toward the hallway, she could not shake the quiet feeling that the simple act of noticing someone's life outside these walls had shifted something between her world and Adrian Romano's world in a way neither of them had fully expected. Lena Brooks stepped out of the Romano building a little after 1 in the afternoon, and the bright New York sunlight felt almost unfamiliar after spending the entire morning inside the calm marble quiet of the Penthouse. The doorman greeted her politely as always, but this time there was a subtle difference in the way he opened the door. A sleek black sedan waited at the curb, its engine running quietly as if it had been expecting her. Lena paused for a moment on the sidewalk, uncertain whether she should approach it. The driver stepped out immediately and opened the rear door with a respectful nod. Miss Brooks, he asked. Lena hesitated before answering. Yes. Mr. Romano asked that I take you wherever you need to go. Lena glanced briefly back toward the tall glass tower rising behind her. 40 floors above the street, the penthouse windows reflected the afternoon sky like polished mirrors. She had no idea whether Adrian Romano was still standing somewhere behind those windows were already back inside his office, surrounded by the quiet decisions that shaped his world. "Queens," she said gently. The driver nodded and waited while she stepped into the car. The door closed with a soft click, sealing her inside the cool leather interior. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, Lena looked out the window at the busy Manhattan streets sliding past. Taxi horns, pedestrians crossing intersections, sunlight bouncing off storefront windows. The city moved with its usual restless energy, yet the ride itself felt strangely calm compared to the crowded subway trips she normally took home after work. The car crossed the bridge into Queens about 30 minutes later, and the scenery slowly shifted from towering skyscrapers to the familiar brick apartment buildings Lena had known all her life. Small grocery stores stood on the corners. Children rode bicycles along narrow sidewalks. It was a different rhythm from Manhattan, quieter and more familiar. The sedan stopped in front of the modest 3-story building where Lena's aunt lived. The driver stepped out again and opened the door. "Take your time," he said politely. Lena nodded her thanks and walked up the short set of concrete steps to the entrance. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cooking spices and laundry detergent, the same comforting scent that had greeted her since childhood. She knocked twice on apartment 2B before the door opened. Her aunt, Patricia Brooks, stood there holding a small kitchen towel, her expression shifting from surprise to immediate warmth. "Lena, what are you doing here in the middle of the day?" Lena smiled softly and stepped inside. "I had a little time off." Patricia raised an eyebrow with gentle curiosity. "Your job finally decided to be generous?" Lena shrugged slightly, unsure how to explain the situation in a way that would make sense. "Something like that." Patricia returned to the kitchen while Lena followed her, the familiar apartment wrapping around her like a quiet memory. A pot simmered on the stove, filling the room with the warm scent of homemade soup. The small kitchen table near the window held a stack of unopened mail and a pair of reading glasses. Patricia turned toward her niece with a thoughtful look. "You seem distracted," she said calmly. Lena sat down at the table, resting her hands lightly on the surface. "Work has been different lately." Patricia studied her carefully. "Different how?" Lena looked down at the table for a moment before answering. "The man I work for notices things." Patricia smiled slightly. "A good employer should." Lena nodded, though the explanation still felt incomplete even in her own mind. Because what Adrian Romano had done was not simply notice something. He had stepped outside the invisible distance that usually existed between his world and hers. Patricia placed a bowl of soup in front of Lena and sat across from her. "Sometimes," Patricia said gently, "the people who notice the smallest details are the ones carrying the heaviest responsibilities." Lena lifted the spoon slowly, considering those words. Outside the apartment window, the quiet streets of Queens moved along with their usual calm rhythm. Yet somewhere across the river in Manhattan, a man who rarely stepped outside his carefully controlled world had made a small decision that was now changing the quiet balance of Lena Brooks's ordinary day. Lena Brooks stayed in her Aunt Patricia's small kitchen longer than she had expected, the warm bowl of soup slowly cooling as afternoon sunlight drifted across the table. The apartment felt safe in a way that Manhattan never did. Here the sounds were simple. A neighbor's television murmured through the thin walls. A child laughed somewhere down the hallway. The radiator clicked softly beneath the window as it warmed the room. These were the quiet details that had shaped Lena's life long before she stepped into the polished marble world of Adrian Romano's penthouse. Patricia watched her niece carefully for several minutes before speaking again. "You are thinking about something," she said gently. Lena stirred the soup with her spoon, considering how to explain a feeling she did not yet fully understand. "He told me to come here today," she said at last. Patricia tilted her head slightly. "Your employer?" Lena nodded. "He said family should come first sometimes." Patricia leaned back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. "That sounds like someone who has learned an important lesson the hard way." Lena looked up at her aunt. "What do you mean?" Patricia folded the kitchen towel in her hands before answering. "People who carry responsibility often forget that they are allowed to be human too. When they finally remember, they start noticing the people around them." Lena thought about Adrian Romano standing quietly beside the kitchen window earlier that day, sunlight outlining the calm certainty in his voice. She had met many employers in restaurants and private homes before, but none had ever spoken the way he had. None had noticed the details of her life beyond the work she performed. The quiet afternoon passed quickly. By 4:30, Lena stood at the apartment door preparing to leave. Patricia hugged her gently before she stepped into the hallway. "Do not forget who you are just because someone powerful notices you," her aunt said softly. Lena smiled. "I will not." Outside, the same black sedan waited along the curb exactly where it had dropped her off earlier. The driver opened the door without needing to ask where she was going. The ride back to Manhattan felt shorter this time, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the river as the city skyline rose once again in front of them. When the car pulled up to the Romano building, the doorman greeted her with the same quiet respect as before. Lena stepped inside and took the elevator up to the 40th floor, her thoughts steady again after the peaceful hours in Queens. The penthouse was calm when she entered, the soft glow of early evening light filling the living room. Mrs. Delgado stood near the dining table, organizing a small stack of documents. She looked up when Lena walked in. "I trust your visit went well." Lena nodded. "It did." Mrs. Delgado studied her for a brief moment before giving a small approving nod. "Good. Mr. Romano is in the study." Lena thanked her quietly and moved toward the kitchen to return her coat and apron. As she stepped back into the hallway, the door to the study opened. Adrian Romano appeared in the doorway, the evening skyline glowing behind him through the tall windows. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Adrian observed her calmly, as if measuring something he could not yet define. Lena lowered her gaze politely, yet she could feel his quiet attention the same way she had the night before. Adrian finally stepped into the hallway, stopping a few feet away from her. "Did you spend time with your aunt?" he asked. "Yes, sir." Adrian nodded slowly. "Good." The word carried the faintest trace of relief. Lena hesitated before speaking. "Thank you for arranging the car." Adrian looked toward the skyline briefly, then back at her. It was a small decision. The hallway grew quiet again, the soft light of evening stretching across the polished floor. Adrian studied her for one final moment, then spoke in the same calm voice she had begun to recognize. "Just remember something, Lena." She looked up slightly. Adrian's expression remained composed, but his eyes held a quiet sincerity that had not been there before. "The world I live in is complicated." He paused briefly before adding, "And sometimes it is easier when the people around me do not get too close to it." Lena understood the meaning behind the words. A warning. The same quiet boundary he had tried to place between them before. But as she met his gaze for a brief second longer, she sensed that the distance between their two worlds had already begun to shift in ways neither of them had planned.